Welcome back to Asian Art. In this lecture, I want to explore another important Chinese philosophy that developed concurrently with Confucianism we have already talked about. Confucianism primarily focuses on the interactions of individuals to each other and their responsibilities to their relations and to the government. Taoism effectively is about everything else. It minimizes the ideas of individual agency, and it talks about this idea of the flow of energy. You're probably familiar with the symbol I show here, which is often called the yin-yang symbol for the component elements. It's actually referred to as the supreme ultimate, or Tai Chi. Taoism begins in China as a collection of philosophical ideas put down in a book called the Tao Te Ching, which is a very difficult text to translate because it's so ambiguous in its meaning and associations. But it's mostly about this way in which things happen, the way in which the world works. And it focuses on this idea that there's this Tao, this, which literally means the way, that is a kind of sense of how the universe turns. And it gives to this idea, this flow of energy that courses through all things. This energy is variously described as Qi, Qi or Chi. Qi is not moral. It is not ethical. It merely is, and it flows, and it has a certain logic to it in a way. And the best we can do to understand Qi is to kind of go with how it moves. So in a sense, the idea of go with the flow. And so a very famous saying about the Tao is that the greatest good is like water, and so it is like the Tao. So what does that mean? The greatest good is like water. Well, water's good. It nourishes us. It sustains us. We're mostly made of water. But is water good, actually? Water doesn't have moral properties. It's just water. People drown and die in water all the time. Too much of it is extremely dangerous. So it's hard to say it's the greatest good. And so in this way, perhaps the idea of Taoism is there is no absolute good or evil, but there is a kind of flow of things, which is like water. Water moves in its own nature. And so the way it moves is a kind of metaphor for the Tao. The Tao is not water, it is not wind, it is not electrical energy, it is not anything that we can measure or see. It is this life force that connects all things. And now, if this sounds anything like Star Wars, it's the Force. It's because that's where George Lucas got his idea, was from reading the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching was attributed to a man known as Lao Tzu, or Venerable Master, and is probably not the work of any one individual, but a collection of sayings and philosophical ideas that were compiled around 300 BCE, roughly about the same time as Confucius was living. So, who is Lao Tzu? Lao Tzu is this fictional character and who is said to have lived about the time of Confucius. And it is said that Confucius one day met Lao Tzu, and in the story it says that when he meets Lao Tzu, he says, "I have seen Lao Tzu, and I can compare him only to the dragon." that he was this kind of force of nature that was indescribable. And so Lao Tzu represents this kind of important idea of a kind of force that is beyond Confucianism. That Confucianism cannot make sense of the Tao. And yet a lot of what Confucius tried to do was make commentaries on the Tao Te Ching and other important Taoist texts to try and bring them into his philosophical understanding of responsibilities and social structures. But the underlying ideas of Taoism are something quite different. They don't really directly relate to Confucius values. In fact, they respond to this idea that people have an important role as a kind of just fairly passive role in the world. Here we see a Confucian, a Taoist, and a Buddhist together in this allegorical painting called The Vinegar Tasters. This is a popular theme that has been taken up by many different painters over the years, and this one is by the painter Xu Jiangxu in the Qing dynasty. Now in this painting, we see the Confucian who is frowning because he has tasted the vinegar and the vinegar is sour. Much like he believes society should be harmonized through established norms, he wants to neutralize the sourness. The Buddhist is also frowning. He thinks the vinegar is bitter. To him, everything material and not spiritual is bound to bring suffering. The Taoist, on the other hand, smiles because he thinks the flavor is just right. His philosophy in life is to follow the Tao and to find contentment wherever the objective situation may be. He doesn't care what flavor it is. As long as the vinegar exists, there is something to be happy about. Vinegar is vinegar. There is no point in wishing it were anything else than what it is. Another very important story about Lao Tzu is this idea that he created the Tao Te Ching as he became frustrated and disgusted with China and fled to the farthest western border along the Great Wall. And there, at the very edge of the kingdom, he was about to step out, and when a guard stopped him and begged him to leave behind some token of his wisdom. And right there on the spot, he wrote out the Tao Te Ching. Then he packed up and left, never to be seen again. And in fact, there is no gravesite or marker of anyone purporting to be claimed to be Lao Tzu. But this idea that this text of Taoism hovers at the very edges of Chinese consciousness and ability to comprehend it. And it's this because it deals in paradoxes and it avoids absolutes and fixed meanings, something that Confucians are particularly uncomfortable with. So let's look at a text from the Tao Te Ching, one that I find important because it addresses this idea of beauty, something that's not particularly important to Confucianism, but has a very interesting influence on the idea of Taoism. In the Tao Te Ching, it says, "It is because everyone under heaven recognizes beauty as beauty that the idea of ugliness exists." So what does that mean? Does that mean that we can't see something that's beautiful because unless we have something ugly to compare it to? Not exactly. It means that because we understand this idea of beauty, or everyone accepts this idea of beauty, we are, without thinking, without even trying, creating the idea of something ugly. That by any time you call something beautiful and you extol the virtue of beauty upon something, you are automatically creating its opposite, something ugly. Anything, that thing that you call beautiful is ugly by definition. And so we go through the world trying to create beauty, when in fact we are also at the same time creating ugliness. For truly being and non-being are born of each other. This is the key idea in the Tao Te Ching, that nothing we do is done in and of itself. There's an opposite that is also created at the same time. Difficult and easy complete each other. Long and short test one another. High and low determine one another. Pitch and mode give harmony to one another. Front and back give sequence to one another. And so, what is this idea we look for in the philosophy of Tao Te Ching? The Tao Te Ching advises, because of this, that we should rely on actionless activity and carry on wordless teaching. That all sounds great, but what does that mean, actionless activity? What can an actionless activity be? What could teaching without words be? Well, it's saying that if we're creating the opposite at the same time we are creating the thing we desire, perhaps we have to be careful about what we create, that we should act with the understanding of everything we do also something else is not done, or something else opposite may happen. And that awareness of the opposites is an important part of what we say and what we don't say. Now, Taoism has a great influence on a wide variety of Chinese arts and cultural manifestations. I was talking specifically about visual art. And there are certain ideas in Taoism that circulate in the belief of Taoism. One very important idea is the idea of sacred mountains, the abode of the gods, the home of the ancestors. It's usually a sort of cloud wrapped mountain peak that has this sort of idea of a place of fertility. Now, we've talked about the similar idea occurs in India, the similar idea occurs in Southeast Asia. And so we see this here again in China, the idea of sacred mountains, mountains that are an abode of the gods. Now, who created this idea? Where did it come from? It's just omnipresent throughout Asia. I don't think there is a particular source for this. Another important idea of Taoism is that things are not static. There's a sense of change, and things are fluid. And so the art takes on a very dynamic, moving, sensual quality of elements, physical things in change and in flux. And there are also these sort of contrasts in forms that we juxtapose the sturdy mountain with the mists and the rivers and other more fluid and dynamic forms. So you have the sort of juxtaposition of the sturdy and the resolute with the changeable. There's also a sort of fascination with the way nature works, the way natural forms look and appear, and to try and replicate them in the art. Here we see a wonderful example of all of these ideas in an iron censer, which is in the shape of a mountain. Now, these objects are called Boshanlu, which means sort of fairy mountain or a mystical, spiritual mountain. And this, as a censer, is essentially a cup. And inside this metal cap, over this cup, there are holes. Now, incense would be burning inside this cup, and the smoke of it would filter out through the holes in the mountain, and it would come down and fill a bowl that this censer sat in. And the smoke would swirl around the base like a mystical fairy mountain in the abode of the gods. This particular censer comes from the Han Dynasty, which is a time when Taoism becomes resurgence and after the decline in Confucianism. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this symbol we have here for Taoism is called Tai Chi, the supreme ultimate. And it does indeed represent the ideas of yin and yang. Yin is yielding and is the black, and yang is the dynamic, the dramatic, it is the white. And these two, as you see in the circle, swirl around each other. And yet within the yin there's yang, and within the yang there is yin. And you can imagine in that white dot or in that black dot, that also could be a swirling pattern, a sort of infinite regression of yins within yins and yangs within yangs, and yins and yangs alternating all the way down. Now this symbol is actually much more recent than the ideas of yin and yang, and first appears only in like the 16th century China. Long before that symbol, the idea of yin and yang were represented by a tiger, yin, and a dragon, yang. I always remember the tiger, T-I, yin, and the dragon, D-R-A, yang. And so these you see on this sarcophagus, which would be a part of a tomb where someone would be buried, this carving of a tiger and a dragon representing these forces. And it's a very important idea of burial and finding an ideal burial spot for your ancestor would have been something that would have played an important role in the Taoist beliefs you see represented here. Another very important book in Taoism is this book of oracles that called the I Ching, the Book of Changes. This is a very interesting system that was sort of developed for thousands of years in China, probably initially written down in sort of legendary form by this philosopher, statesman Fu Xi, sometime way back in the 3rd century BCE, developing this idea of this way of representing yin and yang in a kind of moving, static, broken, and still lines. The broken lines represent yin, and the straight lines represent yang. If you put 3 of these yin and yang lines together, you have what's called a trigram, and arranged in opposition to each other, you can see this is called the Pa Gua. This is a symbol of balance and harmony. It's actually a symbol that appears on the Korean national flag. If we put 2 of those trigrams together, we form what's called a hexagram, and that provides us with 64 different designs of moving yin and yang lines. This is the basis of this philosophy of the Book of Changes. Each one of these 64 symbols represents a certain state in the balance of yin and yang. And they're put together here in this way to allow people to understand where they are in the world. Now, to perform the I Ching oracle, it's usually a coin method or a yarrow stick method, which allows you to sort of randomly access some piece of wisdom from this book to see where your state of yin and yang are at this moment in your life, and to discover what state it's moving into. So this has been something practiced in China for thousands of years. Another very important idea that Taoism supports is the idea of acupuncture. You probably heard of Chinese acupuncture. This is something that is widely practiced all over the world. And it is possibly as much as 10,000 years ago, as we find stone needles that may have been used to redirect the energy the body. And if you look at this diagram here, you'll see this line that goes down from the nose, across the cheek, and over the neck, over the shoulder, and down to the elbow and wrist. Now, there's nothing anatomical that is being charted here. This is the flow of qi energy that is being charted. It's telling us where to insert needles to affect certain kinds of changes in the flow of energy. And so this kind of idea, a way of looking at the body as a sort of place with flowing energy, just like everywhere is this flowing energy, and using these needles to kind of direct and change this. Now, the scientific understanding of acupuncture it's been proven to have some kind of an effect. It does seem to help people, some people with allergies, some people with all kinds of different sort of intractable complications of symptoms. Acupuncture seems to sort of help with these things that Western medicine is often stymied by. That said, it's still very difficult to understand and systematically test acupuncture in a scientific way, because the very basis of, what is the acting agent that is making this happen is not fully understood or accurately described in a way that is measurable. Acupuncture is a part of a wide tradition of medicinal practices throughout China that go way back in time. There are many practitioners of traditional medicine, and as you see in this picture here, they use all kinds of different ingredients found in nature and derive from them certain properties that help balance the yin and yang of the body. Now, traditional medicine in China is widely believed in. As studies show that as much as 70% of people in China today believe in practice for some kind of traditional medicine in their diets, how you eat, how you live. This is a very wide-ranging belief. Unfortunately, traditional medicine has a very porous boundary. And while there are some things that have seemed to have an important effect and curative properties, the actual study in a scientific way of how Chinese traditional medicine works has been and proven very problematic. Probably the worst influence of Chinese medicine is the use of natural animal parts, including human body pieces and parts and exotic animals that have been used. Now, these are all fairly common creatures here: snakes, turtle shells, dried mushrooms, and whatnot. There is also a very common use of seahorses and very rare and exotic animals like white rhino horn. This has proven to be a devastating impact on rare creatures throughout the world, and also may have led to our current outbreak of the coronavirus. Another very interesting aspect of Feng Shui, of Taoism, is this belief in the flow of energy through the landscape, and a kind of geomancy, which means sort of looking at shapes in the environment and predicting where the most auspicious place to be. And this we can see in this device here called the Lo Pan. The Lo Pan is essentially a compass, and the Chinese were the first to sort of discover a magnetic compass. But they didn't really use it for navigation. Instead, they believed the movement of the needle had to do with the flow of energy through the landscape. And so magnetic compasses are still used today in determining these sort of ideal movements of energy for burying your ancestors. Feng Shui began this way for thousands of years, and much of this Lopan device is dedicated to the practice of finding the ideal location where you will bury your ancestors. The belief is if your parents are buried in an auspicious location, then the good energy of that place will flow to them, and then they will be able to transfer that back to you. So if you take good care of your parents, they, as your emissaries up in heaven, will be able to direct fertility and prosperity in your general direction. Now, here is an example of really good feng shui. This is in Honolulu, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. And there you can see in Manoa Valley. Now, far off in the distance is Waikiki Beach. And this is a large valley directly in back of that. And in that wide, generous valley, there is a hill. Now, this hill has to be some of the most expensive property you could find. And yet it is a cemetery. It is an absolutely beautiful cemetery. And it's one of the things that you often see in really lovely locations, really stunning, beautiful locations. You will find a Chinese cemetery because they want to honor their ancestors with this auspicious location. So think about it. In this valley, you have a hill. So the valley is yin, the hill is yang. And so it's a sort of balance between, you don't want to be at the very bottom of a valley, nor do you want to be at the top of a peak, but you want to find the sort of comfortable middle area, to find the balance of the harmonious use of yin and yang. Now, Taoism began as a philosophy. It was primarily a kind of way of seeing how things work. It only during the Han Dynasty, as Confucianism began to fail and the government sort of was falling apart, people turned to new ideas and they re-identified with Taoism. But they wanted more spiritual assurance from Taoism. So they began to create and assimilate gods and deities to help fill out these practices. And people began to worship these deities in the Taoist pantheon. Now, what's really interesting about this church of Taoism was that animal and food sacrifices were forbidden. There was a kind of respect for life. And it was at this time that also Buddhism begins to come into China. And as people are translating Buddhist texts and trying to understand Buddhism from India, they're using a lot of Taoist ideas. And so Taoism and Buddhism kind of feed on each other, and there becomes this sort of way in which both Taoism and Buddhism benefit from each other's ideological sympathies. Take, for instance, the idea of the respect for life, and also this other important idea that what you do can affect your faith. Remember, in Buddhism, there was this idea that, if you're searching for pleasure, you may going to find pain, because pleasure inevitably leads to suffering. And so the same idea of kind of conditioned co-creation exists in Taoism. So this shrine I'm showing you here is from much later than the Han Dynasty, but it's heavily influenced by a kind of Buddhist pantheon. So it's a kind of fusion of Taoism and Buddhist religious beliefs.